You already know that power alone doesn't earn worship, nor does fear or creation. Worship is alignment, it's imitation, it's moral agreement. When you worship a God, you agree to let its values shape your actions. You agree to place its priorities above your own judgment, and you agree to treat its commands as good. This one rules through obedience, and that obedience always comes with a cost. It asks you to stay silent when conscience speaks, asks you to comply when compassion resists, and accept harm as virtue when authority commands it. This is a question of what worship requires you to become. This is the God too evil to worship. If you too are too evil to worship, check out Pantheon, a brand inspired by myths, folklore and legends. We ship worldwide and are rated excellent on Trustpilot. Link in the description. Roll the title card. Yahweh didn't begin as the supreme God of all existence, but somewhere far smaller and specific. He belongs to a people tied to land and conflict and survival. In the earliest days of the Israelite tradition, Yahweh is a God who moves with armies, he marches, he fights. He's spoken of in the language of storms and warfare, a presence that goes beyond his people. It scatters enemies and it claims territory. Early texts describe him as a God who comes from the south, from the wilderness, places associated with danger and instability. He emerges from borderlands, places where survival depends on force. Where he is praised, it is often because he breaks shields, he shatters kings and drives out rivals. It shapes everything that comes after. At this stage, other gods are assumed to be real. What sets Yahweh apart is he demands exclusivity. You shall have no other gods before me. He positions himself as Israel's God, and Israel is his possession. The relationship is framed in terms of allegiance. He absorbs roles. He becomes a lawgiver, a king, the judge of nations. This expansion happens gradually, layer by layer, as political power, religious reform, and theological reflection reshape him. By the time later texts are written, Yahweh is ruling over the world. But here's the important part. As Yahweh's authority expands, his personality hardens. The trait that defined him earlier intensifies. The God who once demanded loyalty from a single people now demands it from all creation. The God who once fought local enemies becomes the one who claims responsibility for every existence of suffering. He's no longer just a protector against evil, but its source. Declaring in Isaiah 45:7, I form the light and I create the darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. You can hear this shift in the language used about him. He's a God who declares, I am the Lord and there is no other. I kill and I make alive. My glory will not give to another. Assertions of absolute authority. Yahweh is telling you who he is in his own voice. At this point, Yahweh becomes the creator God, the one who brings the universe into being through speech. But even here, creation is framed as command. He speaks and reality obeys. Order exists because he says so. Chaos retreats because he tells it to. Throughout all of this, Yahweh remains deeply personal. He speaks directly. He still issues laws that govern everyday life. What people eat, how they dress, who they marry, how they punish, who they worship. His extent goes into bodies and homes and thoughts. To live under him is to live under constant instruction. And he makes it clear that this relationship is conditional. Blessing follows obedience. Protection follows loyalty. Disobedience brings consequences, sometimes correction, withdrawal, or destruction. He describes himself as a jealous God, not in the sense of insecurity, but in the sense of ownership. He tolerates no rivals because they threaten his authority over devotion. By the time Yahweh stands as the sole God of heaven and earth, he carries all of this with him. The war god has become cosmic. The tribal protector has become universal ruler. But the logic of the relationship remains the same. He commands. Humanity responds. He defines good. Humanity obeys. This is who Yahweh becomes. Through development, revelation, through taking the God of command and placing him at the center of reality. And that matters. When a God defined by authority becomes the highest moral power, worship stops becoming a question of belief. It becomes a question of submission. Once Yahweh is expected as the highest authority, worship stops feeling like something you choose and starts feeling like something you maintain. It becomes less about moments of devotion and more about staying in place, staying acceptable, staying on the right side of a God whose favor can be kept or lost. Under Yahweh, belonging is conditional. You're either in good standing or you're not. The terms are laid out in the terrifying clarity of the covenant. A long list of blessings for perfect compliance, an even longer list of curses for the slightest deviation. This functions as physical regulation. The book of Leviticus provides a framework for every aspect of life. What you touch, how you wash, the very blood in your veins, all of it is subject to the standard of purity that is managed daily. When things go wrong, it's a warning. Worshippers learn very quickly to read their lives this way. Prosperity feels earned. Suffering feels deserved. It's never whether the system is fair, but what was done to fall out of favor. When Yahweh withdraws protection or brings punishment, the assumption is fault. The worshipper turns inward, searching for failure rather than upward for explanation. The silence from God strengthens authority. Even the sons of the high priest, Nadab and Abihu, were consumed by fire simply for offering unauthorized incense. In the presence of Yahweh, there is only the protocol. This changes how devotion works on a psychological level. Loyalty becomes the highest value, endurance becomes virtue, obedience is praised because it proves faithfulness. The ideal follower is the one who absorbs commands without resistance. Over time, this erodes personal responsibility in a subtle way. Actions are no longer owned fully by the person who carries them out. If something was required, then the weight of judgment no longer sits with the individual. Harm becomes easier to live with when it can be framed as duty. The command carries the blame. The worshipper carries out the command. Worship also becomes quiet, careful. Words are chosen cautiously. Doubt is kept private. Questions are swallowed rather than spoken. Stability comes from staying aligned, from avoiding the risk of stepping outside what is permitted. This is what devotion under Yahweh feels like once it settles in. The sense that approval must be maintained, missteps carry consequences, and safety lies in remaining obedient rather than understanding. Once worship takes this shape, it begins to shape conscience itself. Now the damage stops being external and starts becoming ethical. Under Yahweh, morality functions as something you verify. An action becomes right because it has permission. That single shift changes what conscience is even for. Conscience stops being a judge, it turns into a checkpoint. Its role is now to confirm whether it was authorized. Once that happens, moral responsibility begins to slide away. The question stops being, is it wrong? And becomes, was this required? That creates a large gap, big enough for almost anything to pass through. This is most visible in the concept of harem, the total ban. When Yahweh marks a city for destruction, he's claiming the lives within it as his own property. In the command against Amalek, Yahweh orders an erasure. Do not spare them. Put to death men, women, children, and infants. In this moment, the human instinct to protect a child is reclassified as disobedience. The slaughter is reclassified as holy. Entire populations can be marked for destruction by command alone, and that act is recorded as obedience rather than moral failure. When permission defines goodness, morality becomes a tool for reclassification. Acts that would normally provoke or disgust can be absorbed without fracture, as their meaning has changed. The act itself hasn't softened, the framework around it has. Harm can be carried out while the person committing it still understands themselves as righteous. That's the fault line. The functioning system of morality places pressure on power. It forces it to justify itself. It demands explanation when harm is done. With this, power doesn't answer to ethics. Ethics answers to power. Authority issues instruction, and morality rearranges itself around the instruction without protest. The result is ethical numbness. Inner resistance starts to feel like a problem to be corrected rather than a warning to be listened to. Hesitation becomes a sign of weakness. Discomfort becomes suspicion. The ability to act without being moved by consequence begins to look like strength. Faithfulness starts to resemble detachment. Abraham raising the knife over his son in the ultimate proof of his detachment. For 3 days he walked toward the mountain, knowing exactly what was required. He prepared the wood and the fire for the child who was his legacy. In that moment, the role of the father is replaced by the role of the follower. His standing is measured by the willingness to prioritize the instruction over the life of his son. Once people learn to preserve their sense of goodness this way, control no longer needs to be enforced constantly. It internalizes. People begin to regulate themselves. They learn to manage empathy so it doesn't interfere. They learn to distrust the part of themselves that recoils. They learn how things stay clean while doing things that should stain them. That's why this kind of morality is unstable. It anchors itself in authority, which means it can turn in any direction at any time. What is condemned in one moment can be sanctified in the next without contradiction. Once ethics become permission, worship stops being devotion. It becomes a method for making harm feel holy.
At the end of all this, the question isn't who Yahweh is. It's what worshipping Him requires you to become. To stay in alignment, you learn when to stop asking questions and when to override instinct, when to silence the part of yourself that flinches, and how to stand still while harm is justified. How to call obedience goodness even when it asks for something inside you that never grows back. Nothing is taken from you all at once. It happens quietly, gradually, one decision at a time where you defer judgment, one moment where you accept what feels wrong because it was required. You keep your place, you keep your standing, you survive. Something else erodes. The part of you that resists, the part that questions, the part that knows when a line has been crossed. And that part doesn't survive worship like this. A God who demands that exchange doesn't elevate humanity. He trains it, disciplines it, he reduces it. And that's the cost. Not belief, not faith, but yourself.